This was a semi-final that I don't think anyone's really going to remember. The second half in particular, it's quite hard to take, but I suppose the big picture at the end of the day, Leinster are in the final.
Yeah, their fifth final. We know what happened in the first four, so they know how to win knockout cup rugby. I suppose they choked Toulouse today. What they ought to do in the game in terms of tactics was probably break down the game as a spectacle. And while that's not to everybody's flavour, they're not entertainment guys. They're winners, and so in order to win that match, they probably had to be less exciting than they normally are. They had to be less attack-minded. They played territory very well. They choked Toulouse, and I suppose they won easily in the end. So it was a lesson in how to play knockout cup rugby. It was a lesson in versatility from their coaches in terms of their own tactical awareness, and then a lesson in the players' execution of that.
Was it also due to the fact that Toulouse, we saw little flashes of it? We know they can be brilliant. They weren't today, so that was also a factor. They weren't firing on all cylinders, but they made mistakes.
Yeah, they looked very dangerous, particularly in that first 10 to 15 minutes. They went into the game with the leading offloads in European rugby, the leading the statistics in terms of defenders beaten on clean breaks. Two or three, apart from Cheallaigh and Colby, two or three others in the Toulouse backline had similar statistics. So very, very dangerous. But they lacked consistency, they lacked execution at key moments, and I think it was more their mistakes that handed Leinster momentum in that first half. Notably, Thomas Ramos, who obviously is a French international now and probably needs to know better in a European Cup semi-final, but he gifted them two key moments in that first half. So while they were dangerous, they kind of handed it to Leinster in a way.
Yeah, there was a few times where they had opportunities to maybe go for it and they didn't. They took the conservative option. Was that because psychologically were they thinking we're up against Leinster, we got to get what we can, or was it just silly decision making?
I think silly decision making. I think generally they started the game very well with momentum, but there were one or two key moments. The block down from Ramos and also the long kick off from Ramos that went dead, and it unnecessarily gave Leinster a foothold in the game. Both of those things were entirely avoidable, unforced errors, and what Leinster did well was capitalise. Cynical, not so much, but very opportunistic from Leinster because they weren't playing well at that stage.
You mentioned earlier about how it wasn't a pretty game and Leinster have learned how to win. It doesn't really matter how, as long as you get the job done. James Lowe doesn't really go by that script though. I was talking to him downstairs and he was like, well, he likes to do his best, but you could see he was thinking like, yeah, I can't help it, this is what I do.
Yeah, he's a joy to watch, and it's very rarely a left winger can influence how the rest of his team plays. He's usually it's very much going the other direction. The interior part of a team influences how the winger plays, but in the case of James Lowe, he seems to have a free pass from the management to do whatever he wants, and I think the management needs to be applauded for that. I think James Lowe also needs to be applauded, obviously, but there was a concern in my mind going into this game. We probably knew Leinster needed to be tight in order to beat Toulouse. If the game became very dynamic and broken up, it would have favoured Toulouse. So picking James Lowe then as a wing was a risk because he only plays that way. But I think they were prepared to take that risk because the benefits outweigh those negatives. And he took a quick tap off he took a quick 22 to himself 6-7 minutes into the game, probably when no one else would ever have done it, and in turn it led to the Leinster blockdown, Henshaw's blockdown of Thomas Ramos. So you can be very negative or you can be very restrictive on players at times to your own detriment, and I think Leinster's coaching team needs to be applauded for going with a guy who embraces risk to that degree in a semi-final where Leinster needed to avoid risk. So they diced a little bit. They took their own risks in selection, but it worked out for them.
That's one game now over and done with. Obviously they have the hurdle of Ulster next week in a different competition, and then they have to let the hair down obviously a little bit, recover from this, but then focus on the next one, and obviously this is the big one now, the final.
Yeah, and I think I would probably have them as favourites, given that I know Saracens are probably by a distance the best team in England, won relatively easily against Munster yesterday. I still think Leinster will probably go in as slight favourites, just given the personnel they have, what they've shown is a versatility in a game such as today. They've shown a belligerence in terms of how they're going to approach games. The most important thing for them is that they win, and I think it probably makes them slight favourites going into that game over in Newcastle. And obviously they're sitting fairly pretty in the Pro 14 with the Ulster game to come. So they're in an enviable position compared to most sides.
When you are in that kind of position, performances we saw today still not perfect. What do you think? What will Leo Cullen be working on now over the next few weeks with them?
I would have thought right now, the business end of the season, he'll look. He hasn't had to look recently. He hasn't had to look at consistency in terms of selection, because they'd already qualified for the knockout stages of the Pro 14 in early March. So he could afford to pick younger guys, young players, give them experience. I think now coming into the knockout stages, what he'll look for is probably more consistency in terms of partnerships. He'll look to give guys more time on the training field together. Obviously he's not got many games left, so I think the chopping and changing, the experimentation with squad will probably, I would imagine it'll cease to a greater degree in the last few weeks.